The November wind cut through Fort Larned like a blade through canvas, carrying with it the bitter promise of Kansas winter. General Thomas Redding stood at his office window, watching the prairie grass bend and break under invisible pressure, and thought about how easily the world could be shaped by force alone. He was 43 years old, square-shouldered and iron-jawed, with eyes the color of steel and a reputation that preceded him like thunder before lightning. Among the white settlers scattered across Kansas territory, his name was spoken with reverence, the man who had civilized 300 miles of frontier, who had driven the hostile tribes back beyond the Arkansas River, who had made the land safe for God-fearing families to build their futures. The telegram sat on his desk, still smelling faintly of ink and urgency. Washington was pleased. Governor Robinson sent his personal commendation. The newspapers in Lawrence and Topeka were already composing their praise, calling the operation at Sand Creek a necessary action and a triumph of American resolve. Redding picked up the telegram again, reading the words that should have filled him with professional satisfaction. Hostile camp neutralized, threat eliminated, proceed as planned. But what the telegram didn't say, what no official report would ever acknowledge, was that the hostile camp had been a winter settlement of Cheyenne families, mostly women, children, and elderly men. That the threat had consisted of drying meat, repairing lodges, and surviving the approaching cold. That his cavalry had descended on them at dawn, when the cooking fires were just beginning to smoke, and the children were still wrapped in buffalo robes. Lieutenant Marcus Webb knocked twice before entering, his young face flushed from the cold. "General, the men are assembled for evening inspection. And, sir, the scouts report clear conditions to the north, no movement detected." "Good." Redding's voice was steady, controlled, the voice of a man accustomed to command. "Dismissed, Lieutenant." Webb hesitated at the door. "Sir, if I may, some of the enlisted men have been talking about the operation. They're saying the camp wasn't what intelligence reported." Redding's eyes remained fixed on the prairie beyond his window. "Intelligence is rarely perfect, Lieutenant. We act on the information we have. That's the burden of command." "Yes, sir." Webb's boots clicked against the wooden floor as he retreated. Alone again, Redding poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey from the bottle he kept in his desk drawer. The liquid burned going down, but it didn't warm him. Nothing seemed to warm him anymore, not since that morning 3 weeks ago, when he'd given the order to advance. He remembered the way the sun had just broken over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. He remembered the way his breath had clouded in the freezing air as he'd raised his hand, then dropped it sharply downward. He remembered the sound of hoofbeats like rolling thunder, the crack of rifles, the screams that had seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And he remembered most vividly the face of a Cheyenne woman who had stepped from her lodge holding a small child, her eyes meeting his across the chaos with an expression that wasn't fear or anger, but something far more terrible, understanding. She had known in that instant exactly what was happening and exactly what he had done. Then the smoke had swallowed her, and when it cleared she was gone. Redding drained his glass and poured another. That night, as snow began to fall in soft, silent sheets across Fort Larned, Thomas Redding went to bed, certain of 3 things: that he had followed his orders, that he had protected American interests, and that the operation at Sand Creek would fade into history as just another necessary action in the taming of an untamed land. He was wrong about all 3. The dream came to him just after midnight. At first, it seemed like memory, the prairie stretching endlessly in all directions, the morning sun low on the horizon. But the quality of light was different, tinged with red as if filtered through blood or fire. And the silence was absolute, oppressive, the kind of silence that exists only in nightmares or death. Then he saw them. They emerged from the red-tinged prairie like ships materializing from fog, figures walking slowly, deliberately toward him. Women in buckskin dresses, children no higher than his waist, elderly men with faces carved by weather and time. Their clothing was torn, stained with dark patches that he knew were blood. Their faces were illuminated by the strange red glow, and their eyes looked directly at him with that same terrible understanding. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They simply walked toward him, closing the distance step by step, and with each step, Redding felt something inside him crack and splinter like ice breaking under weight. He tried to move, to retreat, to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. He tried to shout, to give orders, to do anything that might reassert his authority over this impossible situation, but his voice caught in his throat like a fishhook. The figures kept coming, their pace never quickening, never slowing, relentless as the turning of the earth. And behind them, on the horizon, he saw it. A wall of fire stretching across the entire prairie, moving toward him with the same inevitable patience. The flames were wrong, too red, too bright, consuming the grass without sound or heat, leaving behind not ash but emptiness, a void that swallowed everything it touched. Redding woke with a gasp, his nightshirt soaked through with sweat despite the cold. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped animal. The room was dark except for the faint glow of moonlight through his window, and for a moment, just a moment, he thought he could still see them, those silent figures standing at the foot of his bed. But when he lit his lamp with trembling hands, the room was empty. Just a dream, he told himself. Just his mind processing the strain of command, the weight of difficult decisions, nothing more. He didn't sleep again that night. By December, the dreams had become a nightly occurrence, as regular and inevitable as the setting sun. Thomas Redding began to dread darkness the way a drowning man dreads water, knowing it would come, unable to prevent it, helpless against its suffocating embrace. The pattern never varied. He would fall asleep and find himself standing on that red-tinged prairie, watching those silent figures emerge from the distance and walk toward him with their terrible, patient determination. Behind them, always, the wall of fire approached, consuming the world without sound. And always, just before the figures reached him, just before he could see the details of their faces clearly enough to recognize them as individuals rather than symbols, he would wake. The lack of sleep began to show. His hands developed a slight tremor that he couldn't quite control. His temper, usually kept under rigid discipline, became unpredictable. Lieutenant Webb started approaching him with visible caution, and the enlisted men whispered when they thought he couldn't hear. But worse than the physical symptoms was the knowledge that word was spreading beyond the fort's walls. It was Sergeant James Crawford who first brought him the news. Crawford was a veteran of the Mexican War, a hard man who had seen more violence than most, and rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying. He entered Redding's office on a grey afternoon, when the sky hung low and heavy with the promise of snow, and his weathered face was troubled. "General, I need to speak with you about something you won't want to hear." Redding looked up from the supply reports he'd been trying and failing to focus on. "Then make it quick, Sergeant." Crawford closed the door behind him, a breach of protocol that Redding noted but didn't challenge. "Sir, the traders who come through from the Western Territories, they're bringing stories about you." "What kind of stories?" "The tribes, sir. The Cheyenne, the Arapaho, even the Lakota up north. They're all talking about the general who was marked after Sand Creek. They're saying you've been touched by what you did there, that you can't sleep, that you're being punished." Redding's jaw tightened. Superstitious nonsense, the ravings of primitive minds trying to find patterns in chaos. "Maybe so, sir." Crawford shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "But they're also saying something else. They're saying that survivors from that camp, a few who managed to escape during the attack, they're the ones who marked you, not with magic or spirits, but with memory. They're saying that what happened at Sand Creek can't be buried, can't be forgotten, and that you'll carry it until you face what you did." "I face what I did every day, Sergeant." I made a command decision based on the intelligence I was given. If that intelligence was faulty, the fault lies with those who provided it, not with me." Crawford met his eyes steadily. "With respect, sir, the men who were there, our own men, they're saying the same thing, that it wasn't what we were told it would be, that what we did wasn't soldiering, it was something else." Redding stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Are you questioning my orders, Sergeant?" "No, sir. I'm telling you what's being said, because whether you believe in marking or spirits or divine punishment or just plain guilt, the fact is that the story is out there now. And stories have a way of becoming real when enough people believe them." After Crawford left, Redding stood at his window watching the first snowflakes begin to fall. The prairie was turning white, clean and pure, covering everything beneath a blanket of forgetfulness. But he knew it was temporary. Spring would come, and the snow would melt, and everything that had been buried would be revealed again. That night's dream was different. The red-tinged prairie appeared as always, and the silent figures emerged from the distance, as they had every night for weeks. But this time, one figure walked ahead of the others, a young man, perhaps 20 years old, dressed in buckskin and carrying no weapon. His face was partially obscured by the strange light, but Redding could see his eyes clearly, dark, calm, and completely focused. The young man stopped just beyond arm's reach, and for the first time since the dreams had begun, someone spoke. "You are marked, General." The voice was quiet, almost gentle, with no trace of anger or hatred. "Not by spirits or gods, but by history itself. What you have done cannot be undone. What you have taken cannot be returned, and what you owe will be collected." Redding tried to speak, to defend himself, to explain about orders and duty and the necessities of war, but his voice failed him. The young man continued, "I am called Running Wolf. I survived Sand Creek. My mother did not. My sisters did not. My grandfather did not. I watched them die, and I survived to witness what you did. Now I follow you, General. Not to kill you, that would be too simple, too quick. I follow you so that you never forget, so that every decision you make carries the weight of what you are, so that history remembers not just your orders, but their consequences." Behind Running Wolf, the other figures had stopped walking. They stood motionless in the red light, watching, waiting. "The fire you see behind us," Running Wolf said, gesturing to the approaching wall of flames, "is not coming to destroy you. It is already inside you. You are burning, General, and you will continue to burn until you face what you truly are. Not a soldier following orders, not a general protecting his people, but a man who chose to kill children because it was convenient, because it was easy, because it served his career and his comfort." Redding woke with tears on his face, though he couldn't remember starting to cry. The next morning, he received a report from one of his scouts. A young Cheyenne man had been spotted 3 miles from the fort, moving parallel to their position, making no attempt to hide his presence. The scout estimated he'd been following them for at least a week, possibly longer. "Should we pursue, sir?" Lieutenant Webb asked. Redding looked at the report, at the description of the tracker, young, skilled, moving with purpose, and felt something cold settle in his chest. "No," he said quietly. "Let him follow." Webb frowned. "Sir?" "You heard me, Lieutenant. Let him follow. He's not a threat to the fort." Not to the fort, Redding thought as Webb left, confused and troubled. Only to me. January came to Kansas Territory with a fury that even the oldest settlers couldn't remember matching. The snow fell in waves, each storm following the last, with barely enough time between to dig out. The temperature dropped so low that men's breath froze in their beards, and horses needed blankets to survive the nights. Inside Fort Larned, supplies ran lower with each passing week, and tempers grew as short as the days. But for Thomas Redding, the external winter was nothing compared to the one taking root inside him. The dreams had evolved. No longer did they simply replay the same scene each night. Now they showed him variations, possibilities, branches of a tree whose roots were sunk deep in blood and whose fruit was bitter understanding. He saw the Cheyenne camp as it had been before his attack, children playing in the snow, women scraping hides, elders telling stories around fires. He saw individual faces, heard names he would never know in waking life. Little Star, Quiet Rain, Walks with Thunder, and he saw them die. Over and over he watched his cavalry sweep through the camp like a scythe through wheat, saw the moment when living, breathing people became casualties, statistics, acceptable losses in a strategic operation. But the worst dreams were the ones that came toward morning, when the fire behind the walking figures would finally reach him. In those dreams he didn't burn or die. Instead, he simply stood in the flames and felt everything. Every bullet his men had fired, every scream his orders had caused, every life his command had ended. The fire didn't consume him. It revealed him, stripped away every justification and rationalization until all that remained was the raw, unforgivable truth of what he had done. He began to look like a man possessed. His weight dropped as eating became difficult, the food turning to ash in his mouth. Dark circles appeared under his eyes, so deep they looked like bruises. His uniform, usually immaculate, became rumpled, often sporting the same stains for days. The men noticed, and their whispered conversations grew more frequent and more concerned. Lieutenant Webb finally worked up the courage to speak to him directly on a morning in mid-January, when ice coated every surface and the world seemed frozen in place. "General Redding, sir. I must speak frankly. You're not well. The men are worried, and frankly so am I. Perhaps if you were to take some leave, return to St. Louis for a few weeks, get proper rest and medical attention." "I'm not sick, Lieutenant." Redding's voice was hollow, automatic. "I'm simply dealing with the realities of command." "Sir, with respect, you're not dealing with anything. You're barely sleeping, you're not eating, and yesterday you gave the same order 3 times in the span of an hour because you couldn't remember having given it before. This isn't sustainable." Redding looked at Webb's young face, at the genuine concern there, and felt a wave of something he couldn't quite name, not anger, not frustration, but a kind of exhausted envy for the lieutenant's innocence, his ability to still believe that rest and medical attention could cure what was wrong. "Tell me something, Lieutenant. Do you believe in God?" Webb blinked at the sudden change of subject. "Yes, sir, I do." "Do you believe in divine justice? That God punishes the wicked and rewards the righteous?" I suppose I do, sir, though I believe God's justice operates on a scale beyond our understanding." Redding laughed, a bitter sound without humor. "Beyond our understanding? How convenient. That means anything can be justified as part of God's plan, doesn't it? Even Sand Creek, even the slaughter of children who had done nothing wrong except exist in a place where white men wanted to build their futures." "Sir, you're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in my entire life." Redding's voice rose, and he saw Webb flinch. He forced himself to lower his tone to regain some measure of control. "Dismissed, Lieutenant. I'll deal with my own issues in my own way." After Webb left, Redding sat at his desk and did something he hadn't done in weeks. He wrote a letter. Not to his superiors, not to Washington, but to his brother William, a minister in Philadelphia who had always been the family's moral compass. "Dear William, I write to you from Fort Larned, though I suspect I might as well be writing from hell itself. I've done something that cannot be undone, ordered an action that cannot be taken back, and I find myself facing a question that I never expected to confront. What does a man do when he realizes he has become exactly the kind of monster he once believed he was fighting against? You always said that God's justice was perfect, that divine retribution would find the wicked, no matter how they tried to hide. I used to dismiss that as theological nonsense, the comfort stories we tell ourselves to pretend the universe has order and meaning. But now I wonder if you were right, not about God, perhaps, but about justice itself, that it exists as a force as real and inevitable as gravity, and that no man can escape its pull forever. I am being punished, William, not by spirits or supernatural forces, but by something far more implacable, the truth. And the truth is that I ordered the death of innocent people because it was convenient, because it made my job easier, because I could justify it with reports and intelligence that I never bothered to verify. I am a man who chose comfort over conscience, career over compassion, and now I am learning that such choices have consequences that cannot be filed away in reports or buried in official documents. If there is a God, I do not expect forgiveness. If there is justice, I do not deserve mercy. I write this not seeking absolution, but simply to confess to someone that I finally understand what I am. A man who gave terrible orders, and a man who must live with what those orders created. Your brother, Thomas. He sealed the letter, but never sent it. What would be the point? William couldn't absolve him. No one could. That night, Running Wolf appeared in his dreams again. The young Cheyenne scout stood closer than before, close enough that Redding could see the details of his face, the scar above his left eye, the way grief had carved lines around his mouth, the absolute certainty in his gaze. "You're closer to understanding, General," Running Wolf said. "Closer to seeing what you are, but you're not there yet. You still think this is about your guilt, your pain, your suffering. You still make yourself the center of the story." What else is there?" Redding heard himself ask. "The truth. Not the truth about you, but the truth about them. About little Star, who was 6 years old and loved to sing. About Quiet Rain, who was pregnant with her first child. About Walks with Thunder, who had survived 70 winters and had stories that will never be told now. They are not your guilt, General. They are not your punishment. They are people who existed, who mattered, who were loved, and who are gone because you gave an order without caring enough to verify whether it was right." Behind Running Wolf, the other figures had moved closer. Redding could see their faces more clearly now, not as symbols or representations, but as individuals. A woman with grey hair braided with beads, a boy clutching a wooden toy horse, an old man whose face bore the marks of laughter and sorrow in equal measure. "History will remember you," Running Wolf continued, "not as a hero, not as a general, but as a man who chose convenience over conscience. And that memory will outlast your life, your career, your name. Long after you are dust, the story of what you did will remain, and it will teach future generations what happens when men in power decide that some lives matter less than others." The wall of fire behind them had grown closer, so close now that Redding could feel its heat. But it wasn't the heat of destruction, it was the heat of revelation, burning away everything false until only truth remained. "The question," Running Wolf said, "is what you do with the time you have left. Do you continue to hide behind orders and reports and justifications? Or do you face what you are and let that truth change you?" Redding woke before he could answer, but the question remained, echoing in his mind as February's cold dawn broke over Fort Larned. By March, the ice had begun to melt, and with it something inside Thomas Redding broke open. It happened on a morning when the first hints of spring were visible in the prairie grass, when the sun held actual warmth and the wind had lost its killing edge. He was conducting a routine inspection of the fort's perimeter when he saw him. Running Wolf, standing on a ridge perhaps a quarter-mile away, as real and solid as the earth itself. The young Cheyenne scout made no attempt to hide. He simply stood there watching, his presence a statement and a question at the same time. "Sir," Lieutenant Webb had noticed Redding's attention. "Should I send out a patrol?" "No." Redding's voice was quiet but firm. "I'll go alone." "Sir, that's not advisable." "That's an order, Lieutenant." Redding rode out slowly, his horse picking its way across the muddy ground. As he approached, Running Wolf didn't move, didn't reach for any weapon. He simply waited with that same patient certainty that Redding had seen in his dreams. When they were close enough to speak without shouting, Redding dismounted. For a long moment, The two men simply looked at each other. The general who had given the orders, and the survivor who had witnessed their consequences. "You've been following me for months," Redding said finally. "Why? If you wanted revenge, you've had a dozen opportunities." "I don't want revenge," Running Wolf replied in careful but clear English. "Revenge would make me like you, someone who kills because it serves a purpose, because it's convenient, because it makes the pain stop. I want something else." "What?" "I want you to remember. I want you to carry what you did for the rest of your life. I want you to never forget my mother's face, my sister's voices, my grandfather's stories. I want history to know what you are, and I want you to live with that knowledge until your last breath." Redding felt something inside him collapse, some final wall that had been holding back the full weight of his actions. His legs weakened, and he found himself kneeling in the mud without remembering having decided to do so. "I see them every night," he said, his voice breaking. "I see their faces. I hear them walking toward me through fire. And I don't know how to—" "You can't undo it," Running Wolf said, not unkindly. "You can never bring them back. You can never make it right. That's your punishment, General. Not death, not suffering, but life. You have to live with what you are." "Then what's the point? If I can't fix it, if I can't atone, what am I supposed to do?" Running Wolf was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed older than his years. "You tell the truth. Not the comfortable truth, not the official truth, but the real truth. You tell people what you ordered, what happened, what you are. You make sure that when history remembers you, it remembers all of you, not just the general who followed orders, but the man who killed children because he didn't bother to verify whether his intelligence was accurate. They'll destroy me. My career, my reputation, everything. Yes." Running Wolf's voice was steady. "They will, and you will deserve it. But maybe, if you tell the truth, if you make sure the world knows what happened at Sand Creek and why it happened, maybe some future general will think twice before giving the same kind of order you gave. Maybe some future commander will ask one more question, verify one more fact, care enough to look beyond the convenient narrative." Redding looked up at the young man standing over him. This survivor who had every right to hatred and violence, but had chosen instead something far more difficult. Witness. Justice without mercy. Truth without compromise. "I'll do it," Redding whispered. "I'll tell the truth. All of it." Running Wolf nodded once. "Then my work is done. I will return to what remains of my people. But know this, General, I will be watching. I will be listening. And if you fail to keep your word, if you try to hide behind orders and reports again, I will find you. And next time, I will not be so patient." He turned and walked away across the prairie, his figure growing smaller until it merged with the horizon. Redding remained kneeling in the mud, feeling the weak spring sun on his face, and for the first time in months he felt something other than guilt and despair. He felt purpose. The report Thomas Redding wrote over the next 3 weeks was unlike any document a U.S. Army general had ever produced. It detailed everything: the faulty intelligence, the lack of verification, the deliberate choice to attack despite warning signs that the camp was peaceful. It named the victims he had learned about through his dreams and his own tortured research: Little Star, Quiet Rain, Walks with Thunder, and dozens more. It described not just the military operation, but its human cost in unflinching detail. Most importantly, it accepted full responsibility. No deflection to subordinates, no hiding behind the chain of command, no claims of just following orders. He was the commanding officer. He had given the order. He was accountable. He sent copies to Washington, to Governor Robinson, to the newspapers in Lawrence and Topeka. He sent a copy to his brother William with a note: "You were right about justice. Pray for me, but do not forgive me." The response was immediate and devastating. Within 2 weeks he was relieved of command. Within a month, there were calls for his court-martial. Within 2 months, his name had become synonymous with military excess and moral failure. But what surprised everyone, perhaps even Reading himself, was that he didn't fight it. He accepted every consequence, endured every condemnation, bore every weight of public shame without protest or justification. When questioned by military tribunals, he told the truth. When interviewed by newspapers, he told the truth. When his former colleagues and supporters urged him to recant, to walk back his confessions, to save himself, he refused. "I can't undo what I did," he told one reporter from the New York Tribune, "but I can make sure the world knows what it was. I can make sure that my name becomes a warning rather than an example. I can face what I am and let history judge me accordingly." The dreams didn't stop. Every night he still saw the red-tinged prairie, the walking figures, the approaching fire. But slowly, gradually, the dreams began to change. The figures no longer walked toward him in silence. They walked with him, bearing witness to his testimony, ensuring that their stories were told alongside his confessions. Running Wolf appeared one last time, on a night in late May when spring had fully arrived and the prairie was green with new growth. "You kept your word," the young scout said. "You faced what you are." "It doesn't feel like enough," Reading replied. "It will never be enough." "No, it won't. But it's something. It's a truth that will exist in history, a warning that others might heed. That's not redemption, General, but it's responsibility. It's you finally being what you should have been from the beginning, accountable. Will you forgive me?" The question escaped before Reading could stop it, and he immediately regretted asking. He had no right to request forgiveness, no right to seek absolution from this man who had lost everything. Running Wolf looked at him with those dark, calm eyes. "No, forgiveness would erase what happened, would make it smaller than it was. What I give you instead is acknowledgement. You faced the truth. You paid the price. You became the warning you needed to be. That's not forgiveness, but it's something." The dream faded, and Thomas Reading woke to find tears on his face. He lived another 37 years, dying in 1898 in a small room in St. Louis, where he worked as a clerk in a warehouse. No one attended his funeral except his brother William, who said a brief prayer over the plain wooden coffin before it was lowered into the ground. But his testimony lived on. The report he wrote became required reading at West Point, a case study in the moral obligations of command. His name became synonymous with the consequences of unverified intelligence and the dangers of treating war as an abstract exercise in strategy rather than a concrete horror visited upon real human beings. And in the oral histories of the Cheyenne people, passed down through generations, there lived a story of a white general who ordered a massacre, who was marked not by spirits but by conscience, and who finally, too late for those who died, but not too late for history, faced the truth of what he had done. The story ended with a question that each generation had to answer for itself. What would you do when orders come down that feel wrong, when intelligence seems convenient rather than accurate, when the easy path leads toward horror? What would you do? Thomas Reading's answer, purchased at the cost of innocent lives and paid for with the destruction of everything he had been, stood as both warning and challenge. Tell the truth. Face what you are. Let history remember not what you wished you were, but what you actually did. On the Kansas prairie, where spring grass grew over the sites of old camps and older sorrows, the wind carried memories across the land. Some said if you listened carefully on quiet nights, you could hear them still, voices telling stories, singing songs, living lives that mattered, and in dreams and memories and the weight of history, they would never be forgotten.